Daniel Dillon, The Aetherius Anomaly, written by Tane Blackadder, read by Arthur Howard. The phone's ring was a jagged, needy sound, a shard of sharp noise tearing through the low, greasy hum of the diner. It was our phone, the one listed in a single column inch in the back of the Chronicle, the ink now fading. Dillon Investigations, discretion assured. It sat on the counter beside a sticky ketchup bottle and a napkin dispenser, an artifact out of place. It had rung only once before, a call that had arrived like a thunderclap and ended with a judge's tears of gratitude on courthouse steps and a kingpin named Hernandez entombed in a concrete cage. That ring had been a confident, declarative sound, a summons to a known war. This ring was different. It was thinner, reedy, a sound that seemed to fray at the edges even as it pierced the air. It was laced with a faint, crackling static, the kind that gathers on a long-distance line, as if it were traveling a great and lonely distance to reach us. Beneath the bell tone was a high, almost imperceptible whine of pure desperation, a frequency of panic that vibrated in the teeth. It wasn't a summons, it was a plea, a last frantic grab for a lifeline thrown into the dark from someone who had already exhausted every other hope. The sound of it made the hair on my arm stand up. A primal reaction to a cry for help that was already, in its very essence, beginning to dissolve into silence. Daniel's eyes flicked from the dark, bitter pool of his coffee to the old beige receiver on the counter. It was a heavy utilitarian relic from a different decade, its coiled cord stretched and lazy, and with every electronic pulse, its entire body shuddered with a palpable vibration against the formica. Mel, his movements a slow, perpetual ballet of weariness, was wiping a glass with a rag that had seen too much of the world's grime, its original color a long-forgotten memory. He didn't look at the phone, but his eyes, deep-set in a face mapped by years of graveyard shifts and overheard confessions, found Daniel's. He gave a single, slow nod toward the jangling instrument. "That's your line, Danny." The words were flat, stripped of curiosity, a simple statement of a new fact in their shared reality. He then turned his back, a gesture of profound discretion, and busied himself with the coffee urn, granting the moment the privacy it demanded. He didn't move. He just watched it ring, his gaze fixed on the dancing apparatus as if he could, through some grim synesthesia, hear the specific frequency of the caller's anguish in its tremor. He was a man who understood that some sounds carried mass, and this one seemed heavy, a lead weight tied to a thread of hope. He was assessing the specific gravity of the sorrow it carried, calculating the emotional toll of answering, before his hand even left the warmth of his mug. On the third ring, a threshold between curiosity and commitment, the deliberation ended. His decision was made not in his face, which remained an impassive mask, but in the set of his shoulders. He reached out, and the hand that extended was once again steady, the faint tremor of the last 2 years banished by the clarity of a purpose, however grim. His fingers, calloused and capable, closed around the grooved plastic, and he brought the receiver to his ear, a gesture that felt less like answering a call and more like shouldering a burden. "Dillon," he said, his voice a low gravel road, the 2 syllables worn smooth by disuse and carrying the weight of 1,000 silent miles. It was less a greeting and more an acknowledgement of a connection made, a gate opened. I watched his face the way I always did now, my own work forgotten, the screen of my laptop dimming to sleep. I had become an archivist of his micro-expressions, each faint twitch a sentence in the story of his return to the world. The lines around his eyes, those fissures carved by a seismic loss, tightened almost imperceptibly, not with irritation, but with a focused intensity, like a man sighting down a long barrel. His gaze turned inward, absorbing the frequency of the voice on the other end, and the slight unconscious tilt of his head told me everything. He wasn't hearing a sales pitch or a wrong number. The cadence was all wrong for that. This was the broken staccato rhythm of genuine distress, the kind that can't be faked. He was hearing a ghost story, a narrative whispered from the edge of a personal abyss, and the chill of it was settling into the very lines of his face. "Slow down, ma'am," he said, and his tone underwent a subtle alchemy, the gravel shifting, softening into something smoother, more patient. It was a tone I'd only heard him use once before. With Emily Atticus, a gentle firmness designed to build a raft in a churning sea of panic. It was the voice of a man who knew that before you can solve a mystery, you must first build a timeline. And before you can build a timeline, you must first calm a human heart. Start from the beginning. The instruction was quiet, an invitation to order the chaos. He reached for the napkin dispenser, pulling one free and settling his pen against it, ready to transcribe the first fragile fragments of a new nightmare. He listened for a long time, a statue of concentration in the diner's perpetual twilight. His free hand, the one not holding the receiver, began a slow, absent-minded pilgrimage around the chipped rim of his coffee mug. His index finger traced the ceramic curve, following a path of tiny hairline fractures, with a tactile focus that seemed to anchor him to the physical world as the horrific narrative unfolded in his ear. The morning light, weak and anemic, strained through the accumulated grime of the diner's window, a filter of neglect that softened the harsh edges of the room. This diluted sunbeam found the silver streaks at his temples, igniting them into sharp metallic threads against the darker hair. In that stark, honest light, he looked older than he was. It wasn't merely age, but a deep, fundamental weathering, as if he were a cliff face that had endured a century of brutal storms in a handful of years. Each loss and regret etching a new line, each hard decision wearing away another softness, until only this resilient, unyielding core remained. The silence on our side of the booth was a held breath, punctuated only by the soft scrape of his finger on ceramic and the distant hiss of Mel's grill. "Aetherius Corp," he finally repeated, his voice low and flat, the two words dropping onto the formica table between us with the inert, heavy finality of a lead weight. The name hung in the greasy air, instantly changing the atmosphere of the booth. I knew it. Everyone in the city did. It was impossible not to. Aetherius was the city's gleaming crown jewel of biotech and advanced R&D, a soaring fortress of mirrored glass and unchecked ambition on the sterilized north side of the river. It was a world away from the cracked vinyl and grounded despair of Mel's griddle, a symbol of a future being built on a foundation of algorithms and gene sequencers, a place that dealt in abstractions, not the tangible grief of a missing person. To hear that name here in this context felt like a profound category error. "And your husband's name?" he asked, his pen now poised over the napkin, ready to translate this abstraction back into a man, to find the human story swallowed by the corporate leviathan. His pen moved, a quick, efficient scratching that was the only sharp sound in the booth's heavy atmosphere. He wasn't just writing. He was building a skeleton, a framework of stark facts upon which the flesh of this new horror would be hung. "Leo Cruz, night security. Missing 36 hours. The letters were blocky and precise, a soldier's handwriting, each word a bullet point in a briefing, for a mission he was already committing to. "The police?" he asked, his voice flat, a professional formality. A pause. His eyes, fixed on some middle distance beyond the rain-streaked window, saw the inevitable bureaucratic response unfold before the woman even described it. A slight cynical twist of his lips, a fleeting, bitter ghost of a smile that acknowledged a familiar, systemic failure. "I see." He listened again, and now his body reacted, his jaw working, a muscle clenching and unclenching beneath the skin, as if he were physically grinding down the frustrating inadequacy of the official response. A note. The words were absorbed, catalogued. And the feed. Right. He processed this, the strange specificity of the clue layering onto the professional negligence, the equation of the case becoming more complex. He finally looked at me, and in that look was the unspoken command, a silent transmission that bypassed words. The faint, focused light in his eyes, the slight tightening at their corners, it was all there. This was real. This was uncontained by official channels. This was ours. We can meet 1 hour. Mel's griddle. You know it. His tone was no longer a question for the client. It was a statement of fact, an offering of the only sanctuary we could provide. He gave a short, final nod to the voice on the phone, a gesture of pure, grim assurance, and hung up. The receiver settled back into its cradle with a soft, definitive click. He slid the napkin across to me, the paper whispering against the formica. On it, beneath the initial facts, he'd written more, the pen digging deep into the fibrous surface. Ilara Cruz. Husband Leo vanished from Aetherius. Carpse walked off. Note, it's in the silence between the frames. Security feed has shadows. The last word was underlined twice, a dark, impatient score that held a universe of dreadful implication. Shadows? I asked, my accountant's mind instinctively latching onto the frustratingly vague term, a part of me already wanting to quantify it, to define its margins and taxonomize its properties into a clean column of data. A shadow was a deficit of light, a measurable phenomenon. It should have a source, a length, a direction. It was not a thing in itself. Daniel's eyes were dark, not just in color but in depth, holding a cold understanding of something I could not yet grasp. That's what she said, he confirmed, his voice low and steady. Shadows that shouldn't be there. The way he said it, the deliberate, grim weight he gave to each word, suggested something that defied my ledgers. These weren't absences of light. They were presences. An hour later, the bell above Mel's door chimed with a soft, hesitant note, and a woman walked into the diner. Her entrance was so antithetical to the usual clatter and grease-scented warmth that the very air seemed to still around her, the particles of dust hanging motionless in the weak light, as if holding their breath. Ilara Cruz was a portrait of profound displacement, drowning in an oversized charcoal-grey wool coat that seemed to swallow her whole, its bulk making her appear both fragile and lost. Her dark hair was pulled back in a haphazard bun, a style that spoke of utter neglect, with strands escaping as if she'd been running her hands through it for days on a frantic, sleepless loop. But her eyes were the most striking thing. They were a fierce, intelligent brown, the kind that belonged in a university library or a research lab, capable of deep focus and sharp analysis. Now, however, they were wide, shocky, ringed with the devastating purple bruises of exhaustion and a raw, undiluted fear that seemed to leak into the very space around her. She looked like a scholar who had just stumbled, blinking and disoriented, into an active war zone, still clutching a textbook, while the world exploded around her. She saw us, the only other souls in the place at this hollow hour, and she approached not with purpose but with a halting, uncertain gait, each step a question. She moved like a stray animal, one that had been kicked too many times. Its entire world narrowed to a single calculation. Were we shelter? Or were we just another threat in a landscape that had suddenly become predatory? She stopped a few feet from the booth, her hands clenched deep within the pockets of her coat, her posture a silent plea for someone to make the first move, to tell her what to do next. "Mr. Dillon," she whispered, the words escaping her as a thin, frayed vapor of sound, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerated display case. It was less a question, and more a tentative identification, a hope spoken aloud to see if it would hold its shape in the real air of the diner. Daniel's response was a study in quiet containment. He didn't stand, didn't offer a handshake that he knew would likely go unaccepted, or be as tremulous as her voice. Instead, he simply gestured with a slow, deliberate motion to the empty space in the booth across from him. The gesture was an offering of sanctuary, not ceremony. "Sit," he said, his own voice lowered to match the hushed tone she had established, creating a confidential circle within the public space. "This is my associate, Michael Nollid." He didn't elaborate on my role. Titles were meaningless here. There were only people who could help and people who needed it. He went straight to the heart of it, the anchor points of her reality. "You said on the phone your husband is missing." The sentence was a permission slip. She sank into the vinyl as if the bones had been removed from her body, the cushion emitting a soft sigh that echoed her own palpable relief at being able to finally stop standing, to finally sit with the weight of it. Her hands, pale and slender, were trembling as she placed a worn leather satchel on the table, handling it as if it were both a sacred relic and a piece of damning evidence. "Leo," she began, and the speaking of his name was a small, painful act of courage. He's a good man, a careful man." She was building his defense for a jury that had already reached a verdict without him. He wouldn't just leave. He texted me good night at 2 a.m. Everything was normal. Then his relief showed up at 6 and he was gone. His car was still in the lot. His lunch was in the break room fridge. Her voice hitched on the word fridge, the sheer normalcy of an uneaten sandwich, somehow underscoring the profound abnormality of his disappearance. They said he must have gotten stressed, walked off. But he's not like that. Her eyes pleaded with us to understand the fundamental truth of the man she knew. "He has a routine. He waters the ferns on Tuesdays." She said it with a devastating simplicity, as if this mundane, tender detail, this small, weekly act of care, was the unshakable cornerstone of their entire universe. The ultimate proof that a man who nurtured life on a schedule would not simply vanish from his own. "The note?" Daniel prompted gently, his voice that low, calm instrument he used to de-escalate bomb situations. A tone so measured and devoid of urgency, it could make the most frantic heartbeat slow to match its rhythm. It was not a demand, but a guide rope thrown into the churning waters of her panic. Something solid for her to cling to and follow back to the factual shore. She nodded, a quick jerky motion, and began fumbling in the satchel with fingers that seemed numb and alien to her. The leather was soft and scarred from use, and her hands dove into its depths like frightened creatures seeking burrow. After a moment of frantic searching, her fingers closed around something. She pulled out a clear plastic sleeve, the kind used to protect precious documents, or in this case, to quarantine a piece of a nightmare. Inside was a small torn piece of grid paper, its blue lines faint, the kind stolen from a lab notebook where hypotheses are scrawled and data logged. But there was no science here. The writing was in a tight, frantic script, the letters cramped and jagged, pressed into the paper with such desperate force that the grooves were visible even through the plastic. It was so violently unlike Leo's usual neat architectural hand, it seemed written by a different man entirely, a stranger screaming from inside the familiar shell. The ink itself seemed agitated, blotted in places where the pen had stabbed the page, a physical record of a mind unraveling at terrifying speed. My eyes fell to the words, and I stared at it, my accountant's brain, which thrives on order and explicit meaning, recoiling from the chaotic poetry of the phrase. It was a cipher, a locked box with no apparent key, its meaning hidden behind a veil of abstraction. It was a madman's riddle, whispered from the edge of a void, and it lay on Mel's Formica tabletop, between the ketchup and the sugar dispenser, a terrifying artifact that felt both profoundly out of place and like it had always belonged in our world of unresolved mysteries. The sentence just hung there. It's in the silence between the frames, and the air around our booth grew colder, heavy with the dread of what such a silence might contain. "And the security feed?" I asked. She pulled out a tablet, her fingers shaking with a fine tremor that made the sleek device seem alive in her grasp, a nervous bird trying to escape. The simple act of navigating to a file was a struggle, her touch imprecise, hitting wrong icons a testament to the adrenaline and sheer terror coursing through her. I work in their logistics department," she said. The words a rushed apologetic explanation for her possession of something she shouldn't have. "I have low-level access. I pulled this before they could lock me out." It was the act of a desperate insider, a betrayal of corporate protocol for a far deeper loyalty. She handed it to Daniel as if passing off a live grenade, her relief at being free of its burden palpable. "It's from the hall camera outside the server room on sub-level 3, his last patrol." Daniel took the tablet, his large hands making it look like a child's toy. His thumb, calloused and sure, found the play button and pressed it without hesitation. The footage that bloomed on the screen was jarringly high definition, so crisp and cold, it felt more real than the warm, dim diner around us. It showed an empty, sterile white hallway, so clean it looked surgically scrubbed, devoid of any humanity. A timestamp in the corner of the screen ticked forward with robotic precision. 03:14:22. A figure in a dark security uniform, Leo, walked into frame, his posture relaxed, his movements economical and familiar. He was a man in his element, doing his rounds on a quiet night. He reached the imposing, secure door at the end of the hall, swiped his card with a practiced flick of his wrist, and the light above the handle flashed a cool, permission-granting green. He pushed the door open and stepped through into the darkness beyond. The heavy door swung shut slowly behind him, its hydraulic sigh silent on the digital feed. 3:14:55. The hallway was empty again. A perfect static shot of nothing. Nothing happened for 20 seconds. The timestamp continued its relentless march, each digit a hammer fall in the utter silence of the scene. It was an eternity of sterile, uneventful footage. Then at 03:15:15, the door flew open again, not all the way, just a crack, a sliver of impenetrable blackness. And from that blackness, a long, distorted shadow spilled out, stretching itself across the polished white floor like a stain. It was all wrong. It didn't correspond to any logical light source in the hall. It was a shadow without an object to cast it. It was too dense, a black so absolute it seemed to suck the light from the screen around it, and for a heart-stopping second it seemed to twist, to contort against the laws of physics, a thing alive and hungry, before the door was yanked shut again with violent finality. As if from the inside by an unseen, panicked force, the footage ended. The screen went black, reflecting our three stunned faces back at us. The silence in the booth was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the usual diner sounds, reducing the world to the three of us and the horrifying truth glowing on the tablet screen. It was a silence you could feel in your soul, a pressure against the eardrums that was louder than any noise. Ilara hugged herself, her arms wrapped tight around her torso, as if trying to physically hold her breaking composure together. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the now dark tablet, seeing the awful image replay on the back of her eyelids. "He never came out," she whispered, the words a fragile confession of the impossible. The system log shows his card was used to enter, but not to exit. "It's like he evaporated. They say the shadow is a glitch, a data corruption from a faulty server." Her voice gained a shred of steel, a fierce, knowing certainty cutting through her fear. "But that's not a glitch. You can feel it, and she was right. What we had witnessed wasn't a digital error. It was a violation, a glimpse into a wrongness that bypassed logic and went straight to the primal core of dread." Daniel said nothing. His face was a mask of intense concentration. He reached out, his movement deliberate, and rewound the clip. He watched it again, his gaze not a passive viewing but an active dissection. and then again. His eyes were narrowed, but he wasn't staring at the horrific, twisting shadow. He was laser-focused on Leo. He was studying the man's body language in those final, normal moments. The easy, unhurried stride of a man on a familiar route, the casual, almost bored swipe of the keycard, the comfortable set of his shoulders. "He wasn't scared," Daniel murmured. The words so low they were almost for himself alone, a key turning in a lock deep within his mind. There was no tension, no hesitation. He wasn't forced. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and in them was a chilling clarity. He walked in there on his own. Whatever happened in that room, whatever he found, or whatever found him, it happened after that door closed behind him. The horror wasn't an ambush. It was an encounter, and that made the mystery infinitely more terrifying. He looked from the cryptic note, its frantic script screaming from the sterile grid paper, to the frozen image of the unnatural shadow on the tablet, a black stain defying the laws of light and reason. His mind, a precision instrument forged in the crucible of violent crime and brutal logic, tried to fit the jagged pieces together, to force them into a coherent shape his experience could recognize. But they refused. They weren't just mismatched. They were ontological opposites. They weren't even from the same puzzle. On one hand, there was the cold corporate reality of a high-tech firm, all polished steel and billion-dollar valuations. On the other, a vanished man, a loving husband who watered ferns, now reduced to a phantom. Then the ethereal, a poet's warning about silence and frames, a phrase that belonged on a page of metaphysical verse, not a security guard's last message. And finally, the sheer, impossible horror of a nightmare captured on a digital feed, a glitch in reality itself. It was an insane collage of the rational and the supernatural, the mundane and the monstrous. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. There were no demands, no negotiations, only a void where a man had been. This wasn't a corporate espionage thriller. It was something else entirely, something older and darker. This was a ghost story, but one written not in dusty tomes or whispered folklore, but in the stark, unforgiving language of binary code and pure, undiluted fear. It was a haunting for the digital age, and the entity wasn't rattling chains. It was corrupting data and casting impossible shadows. Daniel Dillon looked at Elara Cruz, who sat across from him, her entire being condensed into that one, fragile, flickering thing in the diner's gloom, hope. It was a dangerous currency, and he knew its value and its capacity to destroy. He saw the plea in her eyes, the desperate need for someone, anyone, to confirm that the world hadn't truly gone as mad as it seemed. He didn't offer hollow promises. He didn't swear an oath he might not be able to keep. He knew the abyss they were peering into might have no bottom. He simply held her gaze, his own eyes reflecting not reassurance but a grim, unwavering resolve. He gave a slow, definitive nod, a gesture that was more binding than any contract. It was a pact, an acknowledgement of the madness, and a commitment to walk into it regardless. "We'll look into it, Mrs. Cruz." The words were simple, blunt, and devoid of theatricality. They were a statement of fact. The investigation was no longer a possibility. It was already underway. The ghost had been summoned, and we were now its reluctant exorcists. The storm that was Daniel Dillon, so long dormant and adrift, had now irrevocably found its next target, its chaotic energy funneled into a single, terrifying point of focus. The transition was seamless, the shift from haunted man to hunter complete. And I, his anchor in the tempest, already had my laptop open, its screen a cool blue rectangle of order in the warm, greasy gloom. The logical grid of the spreadsheet waited, a digital sanctuary ready to receive the chaos, to find the hidden numbers, the financial fingerprints, the quantifiable truths hidden within a story of silent frames and impossible shadows. The hunt for Leo Cruz had begun, not with a shout, but with the soft click of a keyboard and the grim set of a jaw. The air in Mel's griddle grew thick, charged with a new kind of static, not from the old wiring or the flickering neon, but from the sheer oppressive weight of the impossible. Elara Cruz's tablet sat between us on the formica like a cursed artifact, the frozen image of that unnatural shadow, feeling less like a picture and more like a hole punched through the very fabric of reality itself, a window into a cold, wrong universe that was now bleeding into our own. Daniel broke the silence, his voice a low, steady rumble that refused to be cowed by the dread emanating from the device. He was a man who dealt in facts, in steps, in procedures. The horror could wait. The puzzle came first. "The note first," he stated, his eyes locking onto mine, cutting through my rising panic with the precision of a scalpel. He was compartmentalizing, and he was pulling me into the compartment with him. The silence between the frames. "You're the numbers man, Michael." It was a title, a designation of my role in this new, insane war. He wasn't just asking. He was deploying my specific skill set, weaponizing my love of order against the chaos we faced. "What does that mean to you?" He wasn't asking for poetry or philosophy. He was asking for a technical analysis, a breakdown of the term into its component parts, a forensic examination of the clue as if it were a piece of financial data with the power to life or destroy. He needed me to translate the esoteric into the practical, to find the handle on this slippery, terrifying thing, so we could finally get a grip. I slipped into the familiar comfort of logic, the one sanctuary where the world adhered to rules I could comprehend and quantify. It was a mental shift as tangible as stepping into a soundproofed room, muting the whispering dread that the video had unleashed. "In digital video," I began, my voice adopting the measured, explanatory tone I used for clients confused by tax law, "a frame is a single captured image. The silence between the frames is the temporal gap, the infinitesimal slice of time and space that exists between one frozen moment and the next. It's a gap, a nothing. Avoid the camera's sensor never actually records. I found a strange solace in the clinical explanation. But data doesn't like nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum, so that void gets filled with algorithmic interpolation, manufactured motion blur, best guess data that creates the illusion of seamless movement. Not—" My voice faltered, the cool logic failing as I gestured weakly at the tablet, at the impossible thing contorting in that digital space. "Not that. What we saw doesn't belong to any known process of error correction or data corruption. It's an intrusion, so it's a place where things can hide," Daniel stated, his detective's mind, so adept at spatial reasoning and motive, instantly reframing my abstract technicality into a tangible physical concept. He wasn't thinking about code. He was thinking about a hunting ground, a hiding spot, a blind spot. A pocket of reality the cameras can't see, and that something else might use. His conclusion was chilling in its simplicity, and he found it. He turned his focus to Elara, his gaze sharp and purposeful. "Sub-level 3, server room. What's in there? What are they doing that requires creating a blind spot in reality itself?" She shook her head, a frantic, lost motion that spoke of her own terrifying ignorance within the belly of the beast. "I don't know. My access is for logistics, shipping manifests, supply orders, budgeting for office supplies. That floor, it's a black box, a rumor. High clearance R&D. The projects have code names, not descriptions. Quantum computing, experimental AI, neurolinkage interfaces, things I'm not told about, things nobody on my level is allowed to know." She hugged herself tighter as if the very admission made her colder. "Leo was just security. He checked badges, made rounds. He wouldn't have known either. He wasn't a scientist. He found out," Daniel said, his eyes dropping back to the napkin with Leo's frantic handwriting, seeing the message now not as a riddle, but as a distress flare launched from the edge of a discovered abyss. He saw something, heard something, pieced it together during those quiet night hours, and it scared him enough to write this warning. He suddenly pushed the napkin toward me, his decision made. The time for theory was over. "The money, Michael, follow it." "Who pays for the obscene power draw on sub-level 3? Which shadow department owns the budget? Who's the project lead on the payroll? Find the pressure points. Every monster has a keeper, and every keeper answers to a budget." The hunt was now on two fronts, his in the physical world and mine in the digital one. I was already opening my laptop, the familiar hum and the cool, blue glow of the screen activating like a shield against the creeping, formless dread that the video had unleashed. The logical binary world of data was my domain, a territory where things were true or false, 1 or 0, and where horror had no place. I needed to retreat into its order. I dove headlong into the digital river of public records, corporate filings and utility databases, a solitary salmon compelled to swim upstream against a powerful, murky current of deliberate obfuscation. Aetherius was no mere company. It was a fortress, its financials a meticulously constructed maze of nested shell companies, anonymous offshore holdings, and deliberately misleading budgetary codes. Each layer I peeled back seemed to reveal two more, a financial hydra designed to bewilder and exhaust any prying eyes. It was a digital game of three-card Monte, where the P of truth was never under any of the obvious cups. Daniel stood abruptly, the motion fluid and decisive, his chair scraping softly against the worn tile. The contemplative phase was over. The man of action had taken command. "I need to see the door," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a wish or a speculation. It was the next objective on a tactical map only he could see. He needed to stand in that sterile hallway, to feel the air, to look at the keycard reader, to absorb the physical reality of the place where a man had been unmade. Ilara's eyes widened, fresh panic erasing the faint hope that had begun to form. "You can't," she breathed, the words a mixture of warning and fear. "The place is locked down tighter than a vault. After I pulled the feed, my credentials were dead within the hour. They know someone's looking. They'll be watching." The corporate beast was aware it was being prodded and had retracted behind its defenses. A ghost of a smile, cold and utterly devoid of humor, touched Daniel's lips. It was the expression of a man who had spent his life bypassing the defenses of far more dangerous entities than a biotech firm. "I don't need a key," he said, the simple statement dripping with a lifetime of experience breaching the unbreachable. His eyes then cut to me, the smile fading into focused intensity. The task was delegated. "Find me a way in, Michael." A delivery entrance with a lazy guard, a ventilation schematic with an access shaft large enough for a man, a disgruntled subcontractor with a story to tell. A weak link. His faith was absolute. Where he would apply force, I would find the precise point of application. The hunt was now fully, irrevocably underway. For the next 6 hours we worked in tandem, a perfectly synchronized duet of starkly contrasting methods, two different instruments playing the same ominous symphony. Daniel vanished into the rain-slicked streets, his form dissolving into the evening's gloom as he became a shadow seeking other shadows. He moved through the city's underbelly with a predator's grace, tracking down disgruntled ex-employees nursing their bitterness in dimly lit bars, seeking out night cleaners and maintenance workers whose eyes had witnessed the strange, unspoken rhythms of the graveyard shift at Aetherius, anyone who might know the true, hidden shape of the monster, lurking in the corporation's polished basement. He was gathering whispers, threats, and fragments of truth in the language of the streets. I stayed anchored in the booth, my world shrinking to the cool blue glow of my laptop screen, a universe defined by lines of code, encrypted financial transactions, and the endless flow of data. The diner faded around me, becoming a vague impression of warmth and scent, as I tunneled deeper into the digital bedrock beneath Aetherius's public facade. And I found it. Not a person, not a confession, but a pattern. A stark, undeniable anomaly screaming from columns of dry numbers. It was a massive recurring power draw, a voracious and constant energy consumption siphoned directly from a specific municipal grid substation. This torrent of electricity wasn't distributed across the campus. It was funneled with laser precision to Aetherius, specifically to a non-public sub-basement, a level so deep it barely registered on official building plans. It was an energy signature comparable to powering a small town, all consumed by a single secret floor. And the project responsible wasn't listed under benign titles like quantum computing or AI research. Its internal budget code, buried under layers of obfuscatory accounting, was a single, haunting word: Project Palimpsest. Driven by a chill of intuition, I cross-referenced the term, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The definition surfaced from an academic database. A palimpsest was an ancient manuscript page, typically of parchment or vellum, that had been scraped or washed clean of its original text to be used again. But the process was imperfect. The ghost of the old writing often remained, a faint spectral presence visible beneath the new, a persistent echo from the past. The name was not a label, it was a confession. They weren't just building something new down there. They were trying to scrape reality itself clean to see what was written underneath, the silence between the frames. Daniel returned as the streetlights flickered on outside, their sodium-orange glow bleeding into the diner's twilight. A lone figure materializing from the deepening dusk. He slid back into the booth across from me, the movement economical, but he brought the outside in with him. He smelled of damp concrete, cheap whiskey, and the distinct metallic scent of cold fury. His knuckles were raw and freshly abraded, the skin split over one set of knuckles, a silent testament to a recent vehement disagreement. "Silas," he grunted, the single name a low, gravelly answer to my unasked question. He didn't elaborate on the encounter, and I didn't need him to. The story was written on his hands and in the grim set of his shoulders. A low-level tech they fired for eccentricity. He talked. Daniel's eyes were dark pools of concentrated intensity. "Said the boys in the lab joke about the ghost in the machine on sub-level 3, but it's not a joke." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even though only I could hear. "They're not working with AI, they're working on it, trying to teach it to see things that aren't on the normal visual spectrum. Things in the gaps, in the peripheries, in the data streams where nothing should be." He was describing a form of digital dowsing, a terrifying attempt to use cold logic to perceive the imperceptible. His gaze then dropped to my laptop screen, to the single haunting word glowing in the center of my research: palimpsest. "What is it?" he asked, the question blunt, demanding the core truth I had unearthed. I met his eyes, the definition feeling both absurd and terrifyingly plausible as I gave it voice. "It's a project to see what's written underneath reality," I said, the words hanging in the greasy air between us. "They're not building a new machine. They're trying to use one as a lens. They're pumping enough juice into that floor to light up a city block, trying to generate the computational power to peel back the layers of everything, to scrape our world clean and see the text beneath." The sheer monumental ambition of it was staggering. "Leo," I concluded, the pieces clicking into a horrifying whole, "must have seen a successful test, or a catastrophic failure." He hadn't just witnessed a shadow, he had seen the substrate of existence itself, and the sight had either stolen him or driven him to send a warning from the edge of that abyss. Daniel's phone buzzed, a harsh, insistent vibration against the Formica tabletop that shattered the intense silence of our planning. It was an alien sound in our analog world of napkin notes and whispered theories. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen. The message was from an unknown number, a string of digits that meant nothing, but the words it carried meant everything. As he read, I watched his face undergo a terrifying transformation. All the focused intensity, the grim curiosity drained away, replaced by something colder and harder. His features seemed to set, hardening into an impenetrable granite mask of pure operational urgency. The time for investigation was over. The time for survival had begun. "We're out of time," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of all inflection, an instrument now tuned to a single, deadly frequency. He didn't look at me, his eyes already scanning the diner's exits, calculating sightlines and potential threats. "Aetherius Corporate Security is en route to Mel's. They tracked Ilara's tablet." The sentence was a damning indictment of the corporation's reach and paranoia. This wasn't a standard response. This was a targeted extraction, a silencing operation. They weren't coming to ask questions. They were coming to clean up a mess. Ilara gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. The fragile composure she'd managed to rebuild utterly shattered, and pure undiluted panic flared in her eyes, widening them into terrified circles. She looked from Daniel to the door, a rabbit sensing the hounds. "Go," Daniel commanded, his voice a low, sharp crack of authority that brooked no argument. He didn't offer reassurance. He gave orders designed for preservation. "Home now, act normal. Don't call anyone. Don't talk to anyone. We'll contact you." He thrust the tablet toward her, the device now a hot piece of evidence, a beacon leading danger right to us. "Take this. Get it out of here." He was severing the link, protecting her by making her disappear back into the mundane world. She didn't hesitate. She snatched the tablet, clutched it to her chest like a life preserver, and fled. She was out of the booth and through the diner's door in a heartbeat. A wisp of fear and woolcoat, swallowed whole by the city's deepening dusk and the indifferent flow of pedestrian traffic. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, erased from the imminent battlefield. The moment the door swung shut behind her, Daniel turned to me. All the protective sternness he'd shown her was gone, replaced by the focused calm of a soldier, locking into a mission. "The weak link," he said, the two words a demand for the solution I was supposed to have found. My heart was hammering, but my hands were steady on the keyboard. I didn't need to search. The data was already waiting. "Where's loading dock?" I said, my voice surprisingly calm as I pulled up a schematic I'd acquired from a less-than-scrupulous city planning archive server. The blueprint glowed on the screen, a complex map of conduits and corridors. "Shift change at 7 p.m. There's a 12-minute window where the internal maglock on a fire stair is disengaged for inventory logistics. It's a blind spot in their automated security protocol. It leads straight down to sub-level 3, bypassing the main elevator banks and keycard checkpoints." I pointed to a specific unmarked stairwell on the diagram. "That's our door." He studied the screen for a fraction of a second, absorbing the route, the timing, the entire plan in a single hungry glance. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. The granite of his face didn't soften, but a dark, anticipatory light ignited in his eyes. It was time to stop investigating and start acting. "Let's go pay a visit," he said, and the words were no longer a suggestion. They were a promise. We moved through the city's veins, two ghosts flowing against the pulsing arterial flow of the evening rush hour. The world was a blur of glowing headlights, steaming manhole covers, and the hurried, anonymous masses heading home, their lives still blessedly normal. Daniel was a shadow ahead of me, his movements economical and sure, his posture coiled and purposeful, every sense attuned to the environment. I followed, my laptop bag feeling absurdly out of place, a briefcase in a war zone. Our destination grew before us, dominating the skyline. The Aetherius Tower, a monolithic shard of ice and reflected twilight, its pinnacle scratching at a bruised purple sky. It was a temple to a cold, inhuman future, and we were heading straight for its altar. The loading dock, when we found it, was a world apart from the tower's sleek silence, a cacophony of rumbling diesel engines, the beeping of trucks in reverse, and the shouted orders of burly workers moving pallets under the harsh glare of industrial floodlights. It was perfect cover. We became part of the chaos, two more figures in the dim periphery, slipping between the giants of commerce through a heavy metal door someone had propped open with a chunk of scrap wood to sneak a smoke. And just like that, we were inside, swallowed by the sterile, mechanically humming belly of the beast. The transition was jarring. The outside world, with all its noise and life, vanished, replaced by the hum of massive servers and the recycled, chilled air that smelled of electricity and cleaning solvents. The stairwell we entered was cold, a concrete throat lit by the harsh, flickering bars of industrial fluorescent lights that cast long, dramatic shadows. We began our descent, the only sound the scuff of our shoes on the non-slip treads and the ever-present droning hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. With each flight down, the air grew heavier, thicker, charged with a distinct ozone tang that prickled the skin and left a metallic taste at the back of the throat. It was the smell of immense power being channeled, of energies being forced to do things they were never meant to do. The deeper we went, the more the feeling of wrongness intensified, a subliminal vibration that felt less like machinery and more like a heartbeat. Then we found it. The door to sub-level 3 was unmarked, a slab of reinforced steel set flush into the bare concrete wall, utterly anonymous and therefore utterly suspicious. There was no window, no placard, only a single sleek keycard scanner set beside the handle, its LED eye glowing a persistent, warning red. It was a silent sentinel denying all entry. Daniel didn't hesitate. There was no consultation, no second guessing. His training took over. From within his long coat, he produced a device that looked like a brutalist hybrid of a bulky smartphone and a taser, all matte black plastic and exposed circuitry. With a practiced motion, he slapped it directly against the face of the scanner. The device whirred to life, its own array of lights flashing in a rapid, complex sequence, a digital duel happening in a microsecond. There was a soft, almost apologetic click from within the door's mechanism. The scanner's light died for a heartbeat, then blinked back to life, but now it was a soft, permissive green, courtesy of my friends at the FBI evidence locker, he muttered, a dry, humorless footnote as he holstered the device. He didn't wait for the victory to settle. He simply grasped the heavy handle and pushed the door open onto whatever lay beyond. The hallway was exactly as it was on the feed, a perfect, chilling replica of the digital nightmare we had studied. It was oppressively sterile, a tunnel of blinding white panels and polished white floor tiles that reflected the cold, shadowless light from recessed fixtures above. The silence was absolute, a thick, absorbent blanket that smothered even the sound of our breathing, making the frantic thump of my own heart seem deafening. The air was motionless and carried a sterile chemical scent, like a hospital operating room. The door to the server room stood imposingly at the far end, a monolithic slab of dark brushed metal, a silent and ominous sentinel guarding its secrets. The note said, "In the silence," I whispered, the words seeming to die the moment they left my lips, swallowed by the overwhelming quiet. The preposition felt critically important. Not behind the door, in the silence. It suggested the phenomenon was not contained within a room, but existed within the very fabric of this empty space itself, a predator woven into the negative space. Daniel approached the door, but not with his gun drawn, not with the aggressive posture of a man breaching a stronghold. Instead, he moved with a strange, focused reverence, a slow and deliberate caution, usually reserved for sacred or deeply dangerous ground. He stopped a few feet away from the imposing slab, but his eyes weren't fixed on it. They were locked onto the empty space of the hallway itself, scanning the void between us and the door as if he could see the very atoms vibrating. "Play the feed in your head." "Michael," he said, his voice barely a breath, a soft disturbance in the perfect quiet. Leo walks, he swipes. The door opens. He steps through. It closes. He painted the sequence with spare, efficient words. Then his hand came up, his index finger pointing with laser precision at a spot on the empty floor about halfway down the hall. But the shadow didn't come from inside the room. It came from right here. It manifested in the hallway. Before the door opened again, he was right. The chilling realization washed over me. The anomaly hadn't escaped from the server room. It had happened right here, in this sterile, silent passageway. The door opening was merely a reaction to it, not its cause. The threat wasn't behind the door. It was all around us. "Between the frames," I said, the phrase clicking into place with a resonance that vibrated through my very bones, understanding dawning not as a light, but as a cold, suffocating horror that crept up my spine. It was no longer an abstract technicality. It was a terrifying physical principle. They didn't just create a camera that sees the gaps. The implications unfolded in my mind, each one more dreadful than the last. They hadn't built a passive observer. Their monstrous project was infinitely more ambitious, more blasphemous. They created a door. The word hung in the dead air, heavy with finality. They had engineered a puncture in the film of reality, a temporary localized tear through which something could be perceived, or could perceive us. Daniel didn't flinch at the conclusion. He simply accepted it as the next operational fact. His hand moved to his pocket, not with haste but with the deliberate care of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. He pulled out a small black unassuming device, a high-frequency tone generator, a piece of kit used by audio engineers to test speaker response and calibrate systems. It looked absurdly mundane in this place of profound wrongness. "If you want to see what's hidden in the silence," he said, his voice low and steady, each word measured and precise, "you have to first create a silence so complete, so absolute, that it ceases to be an absence and becomes a thing itself, a solid void." He was talking about using sound not to hear but to cancel, to manufacture a perfect auditory vacuum as a key. It was a perverse and brilliant logic. His thumb found the power switch. There was no audible click, no warning hum. But the moment he turned it on, the change was instantaneous and visceral. The device emitted a soundless, high-frequency vibration that didn't so much enter the air as attack it. The omnipresent, subliminal hum of the facility's power and machinery didn't fade. It was erased, violently vacuumed out of existence. The fluorescent lights above us flickered, not from a power loss, but as if the very energy sustaining them was being negated, then died completely, plunging us into a blackness so profound it felt like a physical shroud. The feeling of the air on our skin ceased, not like a breeze stopping, but as if the atmosphere itself had turned to inert, dead glass. It was a void. And in that man-made nothingness the world began to change. A soundless vibration filled the air, a pressure that was felt rather than heard, a dense, subaudible thrum that pushed against the eardrums with an almost physical force, creating a disorienting fullness in the head. It was the opposite of sound, an anti-noise that consumed every other waveform in the environment. Above us the harsh fluorescent bars flickered once, twice in a frantic, dying protest, their cold white light stuttering like a failing heartbeat before they guttered out completely, plunging the sterile white hallway into an absolute suffocating blackness. But the terror of the darkness was secondary. It wasn't just an absence of light that descended upon us. It was an absence of everything. The deep, omnipresent hum of the servers and climate control systems that had formed the acoustic bedrock of the basement vanished, not fading away, but being surgically excised from existence. More unnerving still, the subtle feeling of the air on our skin ceased. The constant minute pressure and temperature variations that prove we are surrounded by a medium simply stopped. as if we had been instantly teleported into the hard vacuum of deep space. It was a void, a perfect sensory deprivation chamber crafted from pure negation, and in that man-made void, in that absolute nothingness we had somehow manifested, something became visible. It was not illuminated, for there was no light to illuminate it. It was a presence that defined itself by its utter opposition to the void around it, a stain on the fabric of non-existence. It began as a faint, rippling distortion in the absolute black, a patch of deeper darkness that seemed to swim into focus, its edges shimmering with a chaotic non-light. This was the silence between the frames given form, the gap made manifest, and it hung in the air before us, a split in reality through which we were not meant to see. It wasn't a shadow. The word was instantly utterly inadequate. This was a rip, a vicious, shimmering rift in the very fabric of the world, hovering unsupported in the middle of the hallway as if the air itself had been slashed open with a knife made of nothingness. Its edges wavered and pulsed with a sickening energy, a visual static that hurt the eyes to observe directly. Through the jagged opening was not another place, but a non-space, a roiling, chaotic expanse of grey static that churned like a silent storm, a void that was somehow full of frantic, meaningless motion. It was the visual equivalent of the tone generator's auditory negation, a perfect, screaming emptiness. And trapped within this horrific aperture, suspended in the chaotic grey like a fly in some cosmic amber, was a man. Leo Cruz. His form was faint, translucent, but unmistakable. His eyes were wide, sources of a terror so profound it was beyond screaming, a raw animal panic frozen in a single eternal moment. His hands were splayed and pressed flat against what appeared to be an invisible barrier from his side, the muscles in his arms corded with a desperate, straining effort to push through. His mouth was stretched wide open in a silent, agonized plea, a scream that whatever rules governed this non-space had stolen the moment it left his lungs. The project name finally made perfect. Horrifying sense, palimpsest. They hadn't simply written over reality with a new layer of their own design. Their monstrous ambition had been to scrape our layer of reality clean, to peel it back using unimaginable computational force, and they had succeeded. But in doing so, they hadn't found a blank slate. They had found something already there, a foundational text of existence written underneath our own, a chaotic, primordial stratum that was never meant to be perceived. Leo hadn't been erased. He had been unmapped. He had stumbled directly into the margins of our world, into the chaotic footnotes of creation, and the underlying code of the universe had captured him. A glitch in the system that was now permanently buffering, unable to process his return. He was a man trapped in the parenthesis of reality itself. Daniel moved faster than I thought possible, a burst of pure instinctual motion that shattered the paralyzing horror of the moment. His analytical calm vanished, replaced by the decisive violence of a man who understood that you don't fight the supernatural, you break its power source. In one fluid motion, he ripped the heavy red fire extinguisher from its bracket on the wall, the metal clamps shrieking in protest. He didn't hesitate, didn't aim for the terrifying, impossible rift itself. Instead, with a grunt of raw, focused effort, he hurled the entire weight of the canister, like a discus thrower, sending it spinning through the air directly at the server room door, targeting the precise, gleaming spot where the magnetic lock mechanism was housed. The crash was enormous, a concussive, metallic explosion of sound that was deafening in the profound sensory void we had created. It was the sound of the real world crashing back in with violent force. A shower of white sparks erupted from the shattered mechanism, cascading to the floor like angry fireflies. Instantly, the spell was broken. The building's emergency systems, triggered by the impact or the severed circuits, roared to life. A deafening, pulsating fire alarm blared, and the hallway was suddenly bathed in the frantic, rhythmic strobe of emergency lights, casting the scene in jarring, discontinuous snapshots of light and shadow. The manufactured void collapsed under the sensory assault. The rift in the air wavered like a heat mirage, its edges fraying and dissolving. It flickered once, twice, and then, with a sound that was less a noise and more a felt pressure change, a deep, resonant exhalation like a universe sighing in relief. It simply vanished, sealing shut as if it had never been. Where the non-space had been, there was now only the empty hallway. And then, with a heavy, limp thud, Leo Cruz collapsed onto the cold, hard floor. He landed in a heap, his body convulsing as his lungs, starved for what felt like an eternity, fought to remember their purpose. He gasped, a raw, ragged, sucking sound that was horrifying to hear, his entire frame shuddering as he choked on the air he'd been without for 2 days. Each breath a painful, miraculous victory over the void. We got him out, a frantic, stumbling exodus from the sterile nightmare of sub-level 3. Daniel took most of Leo's weight, hauling the man's limp, shuddering form over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, while I supported his legs, my accountant's frame straining with the effort. We were a desperate 3-man creature, lurching up the cold concrete stairs, each flight a victory. The blaring fire alarm was no longer a terror but a blessing, a shrieking veil of chaos that masked our escape. The stairwell began to fill with a confused river of evacuating personnel, lab techs in white coats, administrators clutching purses, security guards shouting orders that nobody heeded. We became just another part of the frantic current, 2 more responders helping a stricken colleague, our faces etched with a panic that required no acting. We pushed through the west loading dock doors and out into the shocking normalcy of the cool night air, the chaos of the evacuation spilling out into the alley behind Aetherius. The scene outside was a tableau of organized confusion. Police cars and fire trucks were arriving, their lights painting the building in swirling red and blue. Paramedics were already triaging people on the sidewalk. We didn't stop, didn't hesitate. We carried Leo right through the chaos toward an ambulance whose doors were just opening. With a final grunting effort, we hoisted him onto the gurney inside. A paramedic immediately began assessing him, placing an oxygen mask over his face, as Leo continued to gasp, his eyes wide and unseeing, still trapped in some private horror. Daniel grabbed a foil blanket from a kit, its material crinkling loudly, and wrapped it around Leo's trembling shoulders. It was then that we saw her. Ilara Cruz, her face a mask of tear-streaked desperation, broke through the cordon, her cries lost in the din until she was upon them. She practically fell into the ambulance, her arms wrapping around Leo, her body shaking with great, heaving sobs of relief and terror as she clung to him, whispering his name over and over into the crinkling foil. We didn't wait. We didn't seek thanks or acknowledgement. Our part was done. In that moment we were ghosts again, while all eyes were on the emotional reunion, on the paramedics, on the spectacle of the emergency. We simply took a step back, then another, dissolving into the periphery. We turned and walked away, not quickly, but with a deliberate, unhurried pace that suggested we were just 2 more evacuees, shaken but unharmed, moving away from the crisis. We turned a corner, leaving the swirling lights and the noise behind, and let the city's immense, indifferent darkness swallow us whole. We melted back into the city's vast bloodstream before the first official question could be asked, before a notebook could be opened, before our names could become part of a story that could never, ever be told. We were gone, leaving behind only a rescued man and a mystery that would be filed away by Aetherius as a catastrophic systems failure, its true nature known only to the 3 of us who had stared into the silence between the frames. Back in our booth at Mel's, the world outside had softened to a blur behind a curtain of steady, persistent rain, each droplet tracing a lonely path down the grimy windowpane. The familiar diner smells of old coffee and frying grease were a tangible anchor, pulling us back from the edge of the impossible we had just witnessed. The silence between us was heavy, but it was no longer the terrifying void of Aetherius. It was a shared weary exhaustion. Daniel finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to draw strength from the steam rising off his fresh mug. He wasn't looking at me, but staring deep into the dark liquid as if searching for his own reflection and finding something else entirely. They weren't trying to see ghosts, he said, the words measured and certain. He was piecing it together, the true monstrous ambition of Project Palimpsest finally clear. A ghost is a remnant, an echo. That's not what they were after. He lifted his gaze from the coffee, his eyes holding a cold, hard understanding. They were trying to make a door, a permanent threshold, and they succeeded just enough to get a good look. A muscle in his jaw tightened, and they didn't like what was on the other side trying to get in. The implication was vast and chilling. The thing in the rift hadn't been trapped. It had been attempting to cross over. What do we do? I asked, the weight of what we'd witnessed pressing down on me, a colossal secret too big for our small booth. We can't prove any of it. It's our word against $1 trillion corporation. They'll just bury it deeper, build a better door. We don't have to, Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took a long, slow sip of his coffee, a man savoring a simple, real pleasure after facing the unreal. We closed the door. That's the job. He set the mug down with a soft click. The world's full of shadows, Michael. His eyes met mine, and in them was a lifetime of confronting darkness. Most of them you can punch. They're just men with knives in dark alleys. Some, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you just have to outlast. You turn on all the lights, you make enough noise, and you wait for them to move on. We had done just that. We had shattered the silence, and the shadow had retreated. For now. The phone rang again. Its shrill mechanical jangle was a familiar sound, yet in the quiet aftermath of the storm, it felt more invasive, more demanding than ever before. It was another shrill, desperate sound cutting through the diner's fragile peace, a stark reminder that our booth was not a sanctuary, but a magnet for the city's broken and lost. Each ring was a needle stitching us back into the fabric of a world that never stopped needing, never stopped hurting. Daniel didn't look at it. He didn't flinch or tense. His eyes remained fixed on me, and in that look I saw the entire journey of the last 2 years reflected and transformed. I saw the raw, bottomless grief that had once hollowed him out, now integrated into his being like a foundational stratum of rock. I saw the hardened purpose he had rediscovered in the hunt for Emily Atticus and Leo Cruz, a purpose that had given him a reason to move forward. But now layered over it all I saw something new, a weary, profound acceptance. It was the look of a man who had peered into the abyss, not just of human cruelty, but of cosmic indifference, of realities layered upon realities, and had not looked away. He had accepted that the world was far stranger, darker, and more incomprehensible than either of us had ever imagined, and that our role was not to understand it, but to stand at its edge and occasionally push back whatever tried to slither through. He gave a slow, final nod. It was not a gesture of enthusiasm or determination. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation of the pact we had made, of the path we were now on. It was the closing of one case and the immutable opening of another. It was the only answer the phone would ever get from him. The receiver felt heavy in my hand, cold against my palm. I picked up the phone.